On the one hand, we are defiant. We want to go our own way, and we want God to bless our way. On the other hand, we are dependent. Okay? And the wrestling is, how do we conform our will to God's in moving from defiance to complete dependence?
Scott, did you play any high school sports?
No.
No, freshman, JV.
I went out for a basketball as a high school freshman.
Same. I went out for high school basketball and high school baseball. Never made a team.
Yeah, right.
I was recruited to participate in a high school sport, though, by one of the high school coaches.
Fantastic.
I'm going to give you a little information about my freshman self.
Okay.
And then maybe you guess which sport it was that I was being recruited for.
Okay.
When I started high school, I was under 5 feet, like 4 feet, 11 inches tall.
Okay.
And I weighed about, 90 something pounds, 93, 94 pounds. Now, our high school did not have a jockey program or a horse racing program.
Coxswain.
So it was not
rowing.
It was not that.
Yeah.
So what high school sport do you suppose I may have been recruited for?
I'm going to guess it's wrestling.
It was wrestling.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And the high school coach, as he was recruiting me, as I recall, it wasn't for my great athletic ability.
It was your weight.
It was my weight. He even said, again, if I recall correctly, he said, at some meets, you won't even have to wrestle.
There's nobody else that makes that weight.
Because the other team won't have anyone as small as you.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is the senior pastor of East White Oak Bible Church. His name is Scott Burkle. And I'm not sure what weight class you would be wrestling in.
Today?
Let's leave
that alone.
Let's leave it a mystery. My name is Treg Whitaker, and this is the Ask Scott podcast. Of course, Scott, the reason for all the silly talk about wrestling is that you were preaching on Sunday from Genesis chapter 32, the last few verses or so.
That's right. Yeah.
And in my translation of the scriptures, that section is entitled "Jacob Wrestles with God." Yes. So that's why we're talking a little bit about wrestling. We have some few questions about the passage. Are you ready to answer?
Yeah, let's dive in.
All right, here we go. First question is, did Jacob wrestle with the Lord Jesus? And if it was the Lord Jesus, was he incarnate before he is incarnate, as we think of him as incarnate, in Bethlehem, born of Mary?
Right.
What's going on there?
Yeah, this is a great question. The fact is that the Bible describes this person that Jacob wrestles with in 3 ways. Twice in 2 of them in Genesis 32. One of them is that he's wrestling with a man. Then later it says he's wrestled with God. And Hosea 12 says he wrestled with an angel. Maybe better translated messenger. And so my point was, who is it that wraps up God, man, and messenger all together? And it's the Lord Jesus. Now, this does not mean that even though he was wrestling Christophany, an appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament, does not mean that Jesus is incarnate. Let me give a couple of other examples. Anytime the phrase "the angel of the Lord" appears in the Old Testament, I think that's a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. Hagar, Genesis 16. There's several in Judges. Judges 6 with Gideon, Judges 13 with Manoah. There's Exodus 33 where God speaks to Moses and he says, "I'll let you see my back part." Well, it's an appearance. It's not something that has corporeal substance, I don't believe, even though it can feel very much like that. Daniel in the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar says, it wasn't Daniel, it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yeah.
Didn't I throw 3 guys in there? There's 4, and the 4th looks like the Son of God. So there's these appearances of the Lord Jesus. One thing that might be helpful is for us to think that the Old Testament or the New Testament actually helps us see this. It says in 1 Corinthians 10:4 that Christ led them through the wilderness. Or in Jude verse 5, it says that Jesus saved God's people from slavery. Well, he's not there yet. How is that? Well, there are these pre-incarnate, before he took on flesh, appearances of Jesus. Now, this is mysterious because they didn't know it as Jesus. It only is later revelation that reveals it, and it creates all kinds of questions in us, like, well, if Jacob's wrestling a person, doesn't he have real flesh and bone and substance? And the answer is, we don't know. But the fact is that theologians call these Christophanies. The word phani comes from the Greek word which means appearance. It's an appearance of Christ. It does not mean it's the actual incarnation of Christ. That happens with his birth, or more specifically, the miraculous conception.
You mentioned Moses as one of the times where God had revealed himself to someone.
Yeah.
And in a Moses account in Exodus, God explains to Moses that no one can see the face of God and live.
Yeah.
But Jacob's experience, as he describes it, is, I've seen the face of God.
Yes, I saw God face to face.
So which is it? Can you see God's face and live or not?
Okay, so let me add some more confusion to you. Deuteronomy 34, in praising Moses, it says, God spoke to Moses just like a man face to face. Well, how can you not see his face and be face to face? Same guy, Moses. Or John 1:18, no one has seen God at any time. How can Jacob say he saw God? Well, the answer is in the second half of John 1, which is why I call these Christophanies, is that we cannot see God the Father. He's spirit, not visible. Okay, but no one has seen God at any time, but God, the one and only, also called God. He has made him known. Literally, he has exegeted him. He's explained him. And so when we say in the Bible, whether it's Old or New Testament, well, I saw God, it doesn't mean they saw God the Father, but it does mean they saw God made known in the person of God the Son.
People might describe their relationship with God occasionally as a wrestling.
Yeah.
I'm wrestling with God about something.
Yep.
When we use that phrase, is that what Jacob was doing? Is that what's being described here, sort of wrestling as a metaphor, the same way we would say that we were wrestling with God about something?
Yeah. I would answer yes and no. Jacob is really wrestling. Okay, I mean, it's a physical wrestling that's going on, but he is also metaphorically wrestling, isn't he? He's very worried about meeting up with his brother Esau. He's left behind all of the things with Laban, both good and bad, and he's headed back into the promised land to be the rightful inheritor of the blessings that God had bestowed to Abraham and Isaac. And so he's really wrestling with God physically and metaphorically. Yeah.
Wrestling requires that two persons, opponents, are against one another. That there's something that I'm trying to exert my will on you, you're trying to exert your will on me. I suppose my question is that God and Jacob must have been at cross purposes about something. That's what's caused the wrestling. What is it? What is it?
One thing that I appreciated about our video that we did with Luke, and thanks for organizing that and producing that, was that he used the phrase in describing wrestling, imposing one's will upon the other, And that really is part of the essence of wrestling, right? And what I mentioned in the message was the idea that even as followers of the true God, as Christians, we have this kind of schizophrenia On the one hand, I didn't describe it as schizophrenia, but I described, on the one hand, we are defiant. We want to go our own way, and we want God to bless our way. On the other hand, we are dependent. Okay? And the wrestling is, how do we conform our will to God's in moving from defiance to complete dependence? And that's really where Jacob's at.
Yeah. We're so thankful for our viewers participating in the podcast by submitting questions.
Yeah.
One of the questions submitted this week was, the phrase striven with God carries some negative connotations. But God, who Jacob strove with, does not seem to be bothered by or judgmental of the fact that Jacob is striving with him. So the question is it right or wrong to strive with God?
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack here. The name that God gives Jacob now, Israel, means strives with God, or may God strive for him. Okay? And I mentioned that that's kind of the history of Israel, doing one or the other, right? But boy, as I look at the Psalms, I see that God welcomes our pouring out of our heart to him. That with the desire not to oppose him, but to draw near to him. Again, moving from defiance to dependence. It's not wrong to pour out our heart to God. It's not wrong to even strive with God in the seeking to change us into the image of Jesus. There's just the most common psalm is what's called an individual lament. It's where we do that.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with it. Where it can go wrong, and it can easily go wrong, is when we think we know better than God. And when we aren't doing that in order to grow independence, but rather we just simply want God to approve our defiance.
Yeah, right. God is an infinite being. It's hard for us to know his motivations all the time. But inasmuch as you might be able to discern a motivation of God, why does he toy with Jacob this way when it could have ended in an instant? It ends up ending in an instant.
Yes.
Why toy with him all night? What's the motivation there?
Yeah. I think it's love. God is so high above us that if we even caught 1/billionth of the knowledge of him, we would feel like our minds and our bodies are exploding. And so what does God do? He accommodates himself to his creatures. This is a beautiful blessing. And so the fact that he encounters us ever at all in any way, it could be described as toying with us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's an accommodation. This is his love for us.
Jacob walks away from this experience with a limp.
Yeah.
Paul, someone who comes later, his experience was a thorn in the flesh.
Yes.
Both of these things were given by the Lord. And the Lord is the giver of good gifts.
Yeah.
Now, that seems to be contrary to one another. These difficult things, a limp and a thorn, given by a good God as a good gift. How do you reconcile those things?
Yeah. So it's the difference between happiness and holiness. So if we were to think of everything in life is designed to bring me the greatest amount of happiness, we would look at things like getting poked in the hip and limping for the rest of your life as quite the great curse, right? A judgment. Right. And yet, at the same time, God's purposes are way bigger than ours.
Yeah.
And the testimony that I have seen of believers throughout the centuries is that the very thing that brings them, and sometimes God brings into our lives painful things. People will say, I wouldn't trade it for I wouldn't trade that experience because now I know God. Tim Keller mentioned this in the throes of the worst of his pancreatic cancer, that he wouldn't trade the experience of having had pancreatic cancer, which he knew was a death sentence, for what it produced in him. And I think Jacob is the same way. I've been thinking about this since I received that question. And it made me think of one of those, I wish I would have said this in the sermon. You know that phrase where it talks about, and to this day the people of Israel don't eat the sinew of the hip,
yes, right,
all that. And I puzzled about that. What in the world is that? It is that the people of Israel, from this thing that happened to their father Jacob, right, regard this as a holy event. It's a sanctifying thing. And they see it as a sacred thing. So they're not going to eat a thing that's sacred.
Yeah, right.
I just think that's kind of, that thought occurred to me. I want to thank the questioner because it actually produced something more in me in thinking about that text.
Good. So Jacob walks away with a limp.
Yep.
And he walks away with a blessing.
Yes.
But it's unclear, to me at least, what the blessing is. Is the blessing the limp? Is the blessing the surrender? What is the blessing that he walks away with?
I can think of a number of blessings that Jacob received. One is he saw God face to face. There's an encounter with the living God. Second, he is now assured that as he goes to meet Esau, that God's with him. Okay. And thirdly, he's assured that this promise of the blessing that flows from Abraham to Isaac, he knows for sure that it's his. It was told him in chapter 28, but now he knows for sure it's his.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott.
Oh, that's great.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of the Ask Scott podcast. We look forward to the next time when we will join you again to answer your questions about the Bible on the Ask Scott podcast.